You will have heard of these fantastic archaeological sites that have a certain relationship to the sky. Stonehenge is aligned with winter solstice sunset and summer solstice sunrise. Every year, tens of thousands of people gather there at summer solstice to celebrate this event. This is actually the winter solstice. It's because it's off. Yes. This is the winter solstice sunset in 2009 when I was there. Newgrange is another brilliant example. At sunrise on winter solstice, this roof box here captures the sunlight and creates a shaft of light that penetrates into the passage grave. And just to give you an example outside of the British Isles and Ireland, Chaco Canyon, a site that's been studied by Kim Malville, who is also a tutor of the MA, where the Puebloan people, about 500 years ago, built this great house on the hilltop where they would see the full moon every 19 years and never between, rise in between these two pillars in a position where the sun never rises. So the moon was doing something that the sun never does. And the discipline that gives you all of this is archaeoastronomy, which has recently, well, relatively recently, been defined by Clive Ruggles, one of the great scholars in the field, as concerned with every conceivable form of data that might provide insights into the thoughts and practices relating to astronomy in the past. But what I'm focusing on, what this project and this research focuses on, is megalithism in Europe, particularly in the Iberian Peninsula. So I'm first going to introduce the topic. Megalithism started in Western Europe roughly 5000 BC. It is a Neolithic phenomena. It starts in the Neolithic period, which is when farming, pottery and polished stone tools arrive on this part of Europe. Before, people were hunter-gatherers. Then they start to become farmers. Slowly, they introduce farming practices. They also become pastoralists, shepherds. And roughly 1,000 years after the introduction of these elements, they start building monuments. Monuments made out of timber, monuments made out of earth, and monuments made out of stone. And this is where you get the megalithic monuments. These regions, shaded in orange, are regions where you find megalithic monuments. So it's pretty much a phenomena of the Western Atlantic, with some very good exceptions like Malta that Tore will talk about later. So, given that there are so many megalithic sites in the Atlantic facade, and that for at least some cases like Stonehenge and Newgrange, there are good, solid arguments for the people who built them having intentionally encoded an alignment to celestial phenomena into them, does that apply to other sites as well? Can we actually uncover some of the beliefs or the meaning behind these alignments? That's basically what this project is about. The aim of the project is to explore the cultural significance of the orientations of the Western Iberian dolmens. This is a particular style of megalithic monument that I will show you in the next slides. With regards to topographics, so I'm talking mountains, rivers, etc., and astronomical features, but with special attention to their possible place in the belief systems, social, economic, ritual practices, and time reckoning strategies. So calendars, calendrical, seasonal markers, etc. To achieve that aim, 3 objectives. First of all, field surveys. I need to go and visit these sites, take measurements to try to understand their relationship to the sky. I'll talk a bit more about this. Applying new methodologies. I'll also talk about this. This is an important point. And at the end, to try to interpret these alignments, do what I've called multidisciplinary triangulation. We're not just focusing on what archaeoastronomy is giving us. We need to look at the archaeology. We need to look at anthropology. We need to get data from all these different sources to try to understand this prehistoric culture. I've been doing this for quite some time. It all started in the spring of 2010, where I was doing research for the archaeoastronomy module of the MA. And I surveyed, I think, about 30 of these sites. And I thought that was it. But no, every spring when I went back to Portugal, I'm Portuguese, so I was going back home and I would just go on the field and measure another 10. So I kept doing this until eventually it kind of came together as a project. And the last time was this spring, where I was there twice, with one in April, one in May, and Andre went with me on the second season. And I was lucky to have National Geographic sponsor or fund these field seasons, but I'm contractually obliged not to put their logo on the slides without their authorization, so you won't see it. Also, any conclusions are mine and my own. National Geographic has nothing to do with them. So I showed you the distribution of megalithic monuments across Europe. These are the megalithic monuments in Portugal. Each one of these red dots is one megalithic monument that's been recorded. Okay? There's lots and lots of them. Here's a close-up. There's about 2,000 recorded megalithic monuments with georeferences. There's a lot more that were never georeferenced because they were recorded 100, 150 years ago before GPS. That's a lot. They tend to cluster in the north, and this extends into Galicia in northern Spain. So there's a northern cluster, and then there's this southern central cluster in the Alentejo region, which also extends further into Spain, but I'm not including those sites here. However, out of these 2,000 recorded sites, only 762 were not completely lost since they've been recorded. What I mean is that the others were either destroyed or they could not be relocated. Because obviously the recordings happened over the last 200 years, since the antiquarian period. In the last 10, 20, 30 years, archaeologists have tried to relocate some of these sites based on descriptions of the antiquarians, and they couldn't. So either the monument was completely destroyed by farmers, for instance, or it's there but they couldn't find it. So we don't know the exact location. We can put a dot on the map, but it's not accurate, which is what I did. So we have 762, of which only 372 provide clear orientations. If I'm going to study orientations, I don't want a site that doesn't clearly point towards something, because I won't be able to understand the relationship to the horizon and therefore to the sky. So I'm only really interested in measuring 372 sites. How many did I do? Well, about a third. I have done 113 over the past 5 years. You can see that the north has been pretty much covered. This is the picture of all of them. This is what I've done. So it's pretty good, with the exception of some isolated sites further north. The south is complicated, and I've now started to move to the south. But it's complicated because the south is very flat, and it's just farms, private property, so I need to find out who is the owner of the farm, get permission, etc. It's complicated. It's a slow process. And some of you might have heard me talk about the dolmens in Portugal. I was focused in this region. So you can now see that I have extended the research. So what am I talking about? This is what a dolmen, or a passage grave if you want, would have looked like in the past, roughly. It's basically a mound, an artificial mound of earth and stone, like Newgrange, which has a skeleton, a lithic skeleton, composed of a chamber and a corridor or passage. The smaller ones don't have a corridor or passage. Those are the ones that don't give you a clear orientation. But the ones that have a corridor are clearly pointing towards something that would have been meaningful, or at least that's the suggestion. However, most of them look like this. This is the traditional view of a dolmen, or anta, which is what we call them in Portugal. This is the chamber. This is the corridor, in this case composed of just two stones, the tops of which have been lost. And you can see the mound has eroded away. This is the typical thing you'll see. They're not as monumental as Newgrange, but they can be relatively big. Some of them are well preserved by the local councils, like this one. You can see that it's delimited here, it's clean, etc. Others you wouldn't even recognize if you walk through them, like this one. It looks like a completely different site. But it's been excavated and reconstructed by the archaeologists. So we know it was a dolmen. The problem is that all the stones of the chamber here, which was a huge chamber, with the exception of the back stone, have been cut using actually modern tools. So this has been purposefully destroyed by someone in the recent past. Oh, you can't really see this, I'm sorry. But this was really a good view of what you usually get, which is a site that is half destroyed, half intact. I'm sorry you can't see it. I'm not sure that's going to help. There's the skylight there. Well, okay. Well, I need to move on. Sometimes you find this. It doesn't look like a passage grave, but it was a passage grave 6,000 years ago. The corridor is actually there. And it's like, this is also in an incredibly isolated area. There was no roads. There were roads to the wind farms, and that was it. I had to walk for miles to reach this. Thankfully, I had the GPS coordinates, so I knew where I was going. And then I get there and I find this, which was quite unpleasant. Anyway, some of them are in deep, recent forests, like this one. We need to walk for a kilometer or two to find them. They're relatively intact. The tops of the corridor is lost. But the whole thing had a Tolkien-esque feel to it. You know, you're walking into the woods and then you see this sacred, ancient sacred site. It was fantastic. And then you have the Cathedral of Megaliths, as local tourism calls it, which those of you who were at SIAC in Portugal in 2011 visited. Anta Grande do Zambujeiro, it's what it's called. It's in the south, it's in Alentejo. It's massive, and it's completely and utterly the local council doesn't care for it, right? It's a fantastic site that should be in top state, and it isn't. They simply left it there, abandoned it basically, as you see it. Even though, and I'm sorry you can't have a sense of perception, it's really massive. This is me standing on top of the backstone, looking down at the chamber. And this is where the entrance to the chamber would be. So this is basically the size of a person. These stones are taller, heavier, and thicker than the sarsen stones at Stonehenge. This is really a monumental site. Sadly, it's basically ruined. In the north of the country, the dolmens were lavishly illustrated. They were painted with red ochre, with black, there's a bit of gold here, and also white on a different stone. But also carved in some cases. Sometimes hunting scenes, so relatively realistic hunting scenes, other times more abstract. Surely not abstract, it would be meaningful, but we don't know the symbolic meaning. Here's another example. You can't see it here, but I've kind of highlighted the 5 rays. Looks a bit like a star to me, or sun. In the south, they were not illustrated, but these plaques of schist carved with these intricate patterns were found buried in them. We believe that the dead were buried with them over the heart. And some people have interpreted this as a representation of a great goddess, the great mother goddess, if you want. But it's highly speculative. But it does show that there's two traditions in the country, one in the north, one in the south, with different artistic representations. I thought I'd cut this out. It's just quickly to illustrate that when you go to these sites, you go to these places, these are ancient sites that have been inhabited for very long. So you also happen to come across all these historical places. So it's not just a trip to prehistoric Portugal, it's a trip through the history of Portugal. So you get menhirs like this one, which is actually carved here. We managed to get this at night with some diagonal light. You get pre-Roman sanctuaries from the indigenous people just before the Romans did. Early medieval rock-cut graves. And castles, actual medieval castles, thank you, I need to speed through. And medieval cities, medieval villages, which have been kept since the 15th century, for instance. Right, okay. I took too long with this. Methodology, okay, I'll run through this. I'm not the first one to look at megalithic sites in Portugal, obviously. Michael Hoskin has done over 2,000 megalithic sites across the Western Mediterranean back in the 90s with local archaeologists and archaeoastronomers. Specifically focusing in Portugal, he measured several sites, not all of the ones in red, and he then grouped them into these shaded areas. that you can see, well, barely see, to try to find patterns. Because if you group them and there's a particular pattern, then it must have been meaningful. So he would look at that. That was his methodology. But he found no significant patterns. He still claimed he emerged out of fieldwork as solarist, by which he meant that the orientations were explained on the hypothesis that the tombs were laid out to face sunrise on the day that construction began. So assuming they were built on different days of the year, they were pointing towards sunrise on that day, so they had different orientations, no patterns. Fair enough. But I fundamentally disagree with two elements of Hoskins' methodology. He measured a single orientation, what he called an axis of symmetry. So you'd get to your site, this is a plan view of the site, the black representing stones, this is the chamber, this is the corridor, and you would measure an axis of symmetry. Now, can you tell me where's the axis of symmetry here? Is it the orange arrow? Is it the blue arrow? Is it any other arrow? Clearly, straight lines were not important for Neolithic architects, or not as much as they were for the ancient Egyptians, or the Greeks, or the Romans, or the modern architects. They were not interested in straight lines. That's a modern projection. So even though you can define several straight lines here and measure them quite precisely in the field, you're not sure you're measuring the orientation that would have been significant for the Neolithic people. So this might be one of the reasons why there were no patterns being found, because there's lots of uncertainty in the measurement. So what I did instead was to measure what I've called the window of visibility. It's a phenomenological concept. If I were to sit inside the chamber, my only means of access, my only view to the outside would be through the entrance. And what I would see is something like that, a window to the outside. And I know that if a celestial object, the sun, the moon, a star, was to rise in alignment with this object, with this megalithic monument, it would rise inside this window. I don't know where. It could be a bit more to the left, a bit more to the right. Again, straight line symmetry doesn't seem to be very important to them, so I can't say it's exactly in the middle. It's somewhere in there with 100% certainty. So this is what I measured. But unfortunately, they don't always look like that. Sometimes they look like this, because the sites are all different. And sometimes you can't even see the horizon, because there's forests, or there's trees, recent trees, planted in the 1980s. So I had to work around that. Thankfully, there's this fantastic website where you go in, you put the latitude and longitude of your site, and it constructs a virtual panorama. It's the same as you going to the site and using your phone and taking a panoramic photo, but without the trees. And of course, it puts colors to give you a sense of perception, and that's just, computers doing their things. But this is what it would have looked like, so I can use this. And then I can highlight the window of visibility by graying out the bits that you cannot see if you were sitting inside the chamber. So that's the window of visibility for this particular site. The site is pointing towards that mountain range. And I can then look for patterns. But Hoskins' groups, inside of which he was looking for a pattern, were arbitrary. In the north he was using river valleys, which is more or less a natural approach to it. But then in the south he used modern political administrative boundaries, which clearly were meaningless for Neolithic people. Also, the largest one, this one here, covered an area of 15,000 square kilometers. Whereas anthropologists tell us that the maximum area required for a group of foragers is of about 2,000 square kilometers. So what this suggests is that this area, all the 177 dolmens he measured here, were not built by the same community. They were built by different communities. They could have completely different intentions, completely different cosmologies, or chaosmologies if you want. So we shouldn't group them like this. It's very arbitrary. So instead, I will use archaeologically significant scales. Archaeologists are happy to define these scales for us. They call it the necropolis or the megalithic cluster. These are not only sites that are close to each other, but also sites that have similar pottery styles, similar lithics, similar architecture. So there's independent evidence for grouping them in this way. Give you an example, looking at the north region, Hoskin grouped them like this, whereas archaeologists talk about this cluster, that cluster, that cluster, and that cluster, and several isolated sites, which are different, unique. So what I do is I look for patterns inside these clusters and not outside, and then I see if what I find applies to the other sites. Okay, so looking at this region of North Portugal, which has been more exhaustively studied, we know that the sites were built in a 600-year period between 4300 and 3700 BC, even though they continued to be reused for about 1,000 years. What we know of the people, not much. This is prehistory. We don't have writings or anything like that. We do know they were pastoralists. They had sheep and goats. And they would spend the winters in the low ground, in the river valleys, which is where the dolmens are. And in the summer they would go to the mountains, because there was pasture for the sheep, for the goats, for themselves. They would survive, they would spend the summer in the high ground. This is all we know. They were seasonal. But this relates to the astronomy. So let's look at those clusters I've showed you. The first cluster I looked at, which is the one I've published before, Cathedral do Sal. There's actually 2 more sites now, but focusing on these 6 sites, what you see is that all the windows of visibility are pointing towards a particular mountain range in the horizon. The mountain range that we know is where they would spend their summers, because there's archaeological evidence there. So clearly they're orienting their dolmens in a landscape archaeology kind of way. That particular mountain was significant for them. Why? We don't know. But there's a clear intention here. But also you see that there is a region, an orange band, which is the region that you could see from every single site. So if there is a pattern, if we can talk about a pattern here that goes beyond the mountain range, it's that band. And this pattern is actually defined by the 2 most complex later sites. I put the arrowheads there because they have lots of arrowheads, which mean they were built in the 2nd phase of megalithism. So it seems that as they developed their own architectural skills, they were narrowing down a particular band of the horizon that was meaningful. And this actually applies across the board. This is another cluster. Again, the 2 later sites with the arrowheads are the ones with the narrow windows. Here we have very different horizons, high horizons, far flat horizons, but it's the same. There is one band of the horizon that they are all focusing on. And again for another cluster. And again for another one. This tells us something else. This is the only corridor passage grave in this cluster. All the others are simple ones where there isn't a clear orientation. But I used the methodology Hoskins did for those, and I got these red lines. That's the orientation as Hoskins would have measured it. So it's a rough, a crude way of measuring orientation. But you see that they match the one that comes out of the passage of the corridor dolmen. So it means that there is some form of cohesion across the different types of structures, the small simple ones and the big complex ones, always narrowing down a region of the horizon. So what does that mean? And I'm just gearing up to end. I think there's just one more slide after this. Previously I've argued that the first case study I did, that orange band I showed you matched the rising of Aldebaran, the brightest star in the constellation of Taurus, the eye of the bull, and I think the 14th brightest star in the sky. A star that would have its heliacal rising, its first rising in the year, just before sunrise, at the end of April, beginning of May, which would have been the right time for them to move into the high ground, to follow the star which is rising behind the mountain range. This is a stellarium reconstruction. So they would follow this star. And this narrative is actually replicated in folk tales in the area. This very mountain range is called Mountain Range of the Star. And the folk tale behind it tells exactly the same story. It's about a shepherd living in the river valley where the dolmens are, that upon seeing a star rise above a mountain range decides to follow it. And when he gets there, he names the mountain range of the Star. So there's, ethnography, there's anthropology here, bringing it all together. Now, I was very lucky to have found that, So I don't think I'm going to find that for the other clusters. But maybe the same idea applies. Maybe it is a star, the heliacal rising of a star. So I tested for that and found that the 4 clusters I've shown you can be explained as being aligned to 2 stars, Aldebaran and Alnath, the 2 brightest stars in Taurus, the eye of the bull and the tip of the horn. And not only do they explain these 4 clusters, but they also explain 90% of all the others. So all these isolated ones. So you see, there is a pattern, unlike what Hoskins was saying. And it's not a solar pattern, it's a stellar pattern, if anything. So just to conclude very quickly, patterns do exist, but you need to be looking at the right scale. Some of these patterns don't overlap. So we have Aldebaran and Alnath, different intentionalities. Why were they aligning with different stars in the same general area? 90% of all dolmens are explained by 2 stars, stars whose seasonality matches the seasonality of these Neolithic communities. But also, if I add just 2 more stars in the general vicinity, Al-Nilam in Orion and Algol, then I can explain all of the data. 113 sites can be explained by 4 stars. I think that goes against the odds, as Ruggles would put it. I think that's it. Yes. Thank you. Before we go? Okay.
Fabio, thank you. Fantastic, wonderful work, ongoing developing work. We are sort of right at the end of Fabio's time slot, but I think if anyone's got one question, a burning question, Francis?
Absolutely brilliant, Fabio. Very, very convincing, and what I would have said. It just struck me when you were sitting and looking at the view outside. Did you do it the other way around? What does the sunbeam follow when it comes in?
No, the truth is, with the data I gathered, I can also calculate that. And for instance, for the Aldebaran ones, the sun would cast its light in early February and late October. So there might be a second reason there, which is completely different, because
there's no particular backstones or no particular areas in the interior that the sun...
No, there is no pattern in that. Some of them were painted. In some cases, the light would shine on those paintings. In others, not really, because they're not very consistent the way they're built. So there is no pattern there, but it is worth investigating, particularly because, as Bernadette pointed out the other day when we were talking about it, it's early February and late October. It's Celtic calendar, right? So there might be something there. I don't know.
It's just that's very much the pattern in Ireland. That they fall on something specific. And like as you rightly pointed out, it looks very much like the Irish too, who are built by people coming from the Iberian Peninsula.
Yep.
So I would expect me to see some similarities.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Thanks.